Right here, bordered by several countries, lies one of the world's most unusual bodies of water, the Caspian Sea. What makes it so remarkable is that over the past 20 years, its water level has dropped by about 6.5 feet, and in some places the shoreline has retreated by 6 to 19 miles. That's a serious change, and something has to be done to restore it. Not with buckets, of course. The idea is something far more ambitious, linking the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf through Iran with a route roughly 590 miles long. And this would not be a simple canal. The plan involves pushing water uphill against gravity into the mountains, then sending it back down from a massive elevation. And if that doesn't work, another idea is to drill beneath the seabed and pump the water through there instead. It sounds insane, and that's exactly why we're going to look at what's really going on there. A 6.5-foot drop in depth is a serious problem for any body of water. So why is this happening at all? Humans have a lot to do with it. The Caspian Sea is a closed body of water. It's enormous, salty, and almost like a true sea, but it has no outlet to the ocean. No straits, no outside source feeding it. All of its water comes from rivers. After that, the rest is up to the sun and evaporation. The balance is extremely delicate. When less water comes in through the rivers, the sea level starts to fall, and that's where people come in, with their dams, engineering projects, and constant urge to improve things. The Caspian's main source of water is the Volga River. It supplies about 80% of all the water flowing into the sea. It sounds simple enough. As long as the river flows, the sea survives. But over the last century, the Volga has been exploited so heavily that it barely resembles the free-flowing river it once was. Dam after dam has been built along it. Behind them are vast reservoirs. One of the most famous is so massive that it's effectively draining the river. Its surface area is more than 2,490 square miles. That makes it the third largest reservoir in the world and the largest in Europe. So what's the problem? It's not just that huge amounts of water are being stored and used. The real issue is evaporation. Picture the Caspian Sea here. Water flows down the Volga, then gets trapped in an artificial reservoir sitting under the sun where large amounts of it evaporate. As a result, less water ultimately reaches the Caspian, and there are many reservoirs like this along the Volga. Sounds like a huge problem, right? It is. But even that doesn't compare to something as mundane as farm fields. Huge areas in the lower Volga basin and along the Ural River have long been plowed up and turned into farmland. And farmland, as we know, consumes enormous amounts of water. A whole network of canals has been built there. Water is drawn away from the rivers, like through a system of little tubes. Each withdrawal may seem small on its own, but together they add up to a major loss. And in these regions, using enormous amounts of water for irrigation has become the norm. There's plenty of water in the Volga, so why save it? Hundreds, even thousands of acres are flooded with water far beyond any reasonable need. The outcome is bleak. From 2006 to 2022, the level of the Caspian Sea dropped by more than 6.5 feet, while its surface area shrank by roughly 11,600 square miles. People have stripped away a piece of sea the size of Belgium. But the reality is even more troubling than that, the future of the Caspian itself. Scientists are not offering much comfort. If things continue this way, the sea level could fall by another 46 to 59 feet by 2100. It's hard to calculate how much surface area would be lost by then, and why bother? If it's better to ask, is there really nothing that can be done about the Caspian Sea? There is. For example, we could get water from another sea. In 2005, Azerbaijani company ADOG and Zeraport started thinking about a serious problem. If the Caspian Sea keeps shrinking, the port could eventually become unusable. No water means no shipping, no cargo, and no revenue. That's when an unusual idea came up. The Black Sea is relatively close by, so why not bring in some water from there? The proposal was to build a massive tunnel and channel water into the Caspian. It sounds like science fiction, but it was discussed seriously. The route would have to pass through either Georgia or through Russia. The total length would be about 435 miles. In other words, this would be an enormous piece of infrastructure capable of moving billions of gallons of water. That naturally raises the question, how would you make that much water travel such a long distance? Giant pumps? Not quite. Nature may have already provided the answer. The Black Sea sits about 92 feet higher than the Caspian. That's not a dramatic difference, but for water, it's enough. Gravity would do the work, pulling the flow downhill. It all sounds promising, but there's one major catch: the cost. A tunnel like that would not just be expensive, it would be staggeringly expensive. Boring through mountains or even laying a pipeline across flat land for 435 miles would require immense investment. So for now, the idea has been pushed aside. Meanwhile, another idea resurfaced, this one from Iran, replenishing the Caspian Sea with water from the Persian Gulf. But what would that actually look like? This route is called Iran route. It would begin roughly at this point on the Persian Gulf and flow into the Caspian Sea here. The total length would be about 590 miles. Sounds complicated? It does. But in reality, the Iranians even came up with a kind of shortcut to make the project easier. In the south, there's the Karun River, and in the north, the Safed Rud River. The idea behind Iran Rud was to use both rivers to reduce the amount of construction needed. Nature's already done part of the work, so why rebuild everything from scratch? The remaining sections would be connected by man-made canals. That does simplify things somewhat, but there's still a major problem. About 370 miles of the route would pass through two mountain systems, the Zagros and the Alborz. And that's where things become very difficult for builders. Because this is something truly impressive. There are peaks rising 10,000 to 13,000 feet high. Beautiful terrain, yes, but extremely inconvenient for construction. Who would want to build through narrow mountain valleys and deep gorges? Iran's answer was to use tunnels in the worst sections instead of trying to route the canal around the most difficult terrain. But how would that actually work? Iran has had issues with tunnel boring machines, so the answer is much simpler. Traditional drill and blast excavation, a method people have used for a very long time. Explosives are placed, the rock is blasted, then the process is repeated again and again. With the help of specialized drilling equipment, it's slower, but when there's no better option, it becomes the only realistic one. Still, the challenges don't end there. To carry the canal across this terrain and toward the Caspian, the waterway would need to be lifted more than 5,900 feet and then brought back down again toward the Caspian Basin. That's a huge challenge, but there was a proposed solution, essentially creating their own version of the Panama Canal, though with important differences. Of course, no one was planning to build lock systems like those in Panama. For one thing, this route was not intended to be navigable. And for another, a lock system capable of lifting and lowering water over 5,900 feet would be unimaginably expensive and technically overwhelming. So instead, the plan relied on pumps. Large pumping stations would be installed at key points to force the water uphill, defying the laws of physics. In addition, the project called for a network of intermediate storage basins that would break the enormous water pressure into smaller, more manageable sections. And this is a good point to pause for a moment. Doesn't all of this, canals, pumping stations, tunnels, sound far beyond what Iran could realistically afford? A hybrid mega project like this would cost an astronomical amount for a country that's not especially wealthy, and that's not speculation. The main reason the project has never been carried out is its enormous cost. So does that mean the Caspian Sea will never be replenished from the Persian Gulf? Iran may still have a simpler alternative. According to some claims, it could cost as little as $7 billion. Let's head east. There's another idea on the table: bring water to the Caspian through a canal from the opposite side. The route would begin on the coast of the Gulf of Oman, then snake across the country before reaching the Caspian. In terms of sheer distance, this option is even more ambitious, roughly 870 to 995 miles long. The upside is that it avoids many of the major mountain ranges. On a map, it almost looks perfect. Flat, calm, and free of difficult mountain passes. At first glance, it seems like the easiest route to build, but the reality on the ground is anything but simple. The canal would pass through Sistan and Baluchistan, a region where drought is basically the default condition. These are vast stretches of land where rain is rare and the ground is baked so dry it turns almost rock hard. In some places, there are even layers of salt. Farther along, conditions become even harsher because the route approaches areas tied to the Lut Desert. This is one of the hottest places on Earth. Surface temperatures there have reached around 158 degrees Fahrenheit. In that kind of heat, water would not just evaporate, it would seem to vanish almost instantly. Then there's Dasht-e Kavir, the huge salt desert in the center of the country. This isn't just sand, it's a landscape of depressions covered with salt and hard crust where water can quickly seep into highly mineralized ground and change its composition. Altogether, it sounds like one of those projects that sits right on the edge of what's actually possible, but even here, Iran's planners seem to be trying to play it smart. Their main bet is on the terrain itself. Part of the proposed route follows the natural lowlands of the Iranian plateau, tectonic depressions, areas that have effectively sunk over time. The logic is simple. Instead of forcing water uphill, guide it through places where the land naturally creates a path. In other words, use these natural corridors to stretch the flow across the country and reduce pumping costs. And that brings us to the real question. Could this actually work as a way to save the Caspian Sea? Less water is now reaching the Caspian Sea from the Volga and other rivers because those water sources are being heavily used. To even keep the Caspian at its current level, you'd have to replace all the water it continuously loses. And that means enormous volumes, hundreds of cubic miles of water every year. That's on the scale of the world's largest rivers. In other words, it wouldn't be enough to simply divert some water there. You'd basically have to create a new Volga, an artificial one, and a stable one at that. Now add evaporation to the equation. If you choose the eastern route, which seems simpler, those losses would also have to be offset. Unless the canal were somehow engineered so it wouldn't lose massive amounts of water and desert heat that can reach about 158 degrees Fahrenheit. In short, the infrastructure would have to be enormous, and so would the cost. Only then could you even begin to talk about saving the Caspian. And honestly, even that's a stretch, because a water corridor like this would most likely make things even worse for the Caspian Sea. Let's take a look at the map. The water in the Persian Gulf is salty, and not just salty, extremely salty. It's one of the saltiest parts of the world's oceans. By comparison, the Caspian Sea is only mildly brackish. So what happens if you start pouring hypersaline water into a place that was never meant to receive it? That hypersaline water flows in, then evaporates and leaves behind huge amounts of salt. Salt keeps building up. In the end, the Caspian turns into a lifeless saline brine, where many organisms that are not adapted to such extreme salinity begin to die off. So does that mean that saving the Caspian with water from the Persian Gulf is impossible? Well, it might be possible, but only if that water is desalinated first. And that would mean spending billions of dollars on gigantic desalination plants. They'd pull salt water from the canal and then release fresh water into the Caspian Sea. That sounds less like a normal infrastructure project and more like one of the most expensive engineering undertakings on Earth. So the idea that it could be done for $7 billion doesn't seem realistic. It's probably closer to $70 billion. But wait, Tehran's probably not even planning to fully save the Caspian. What it may really want is to send at least some water into the shrinking basin and at the same time reshape global trade. Let me explain. Now picture a standard route from Mumbai, India to St. Petersburg, Russia. Today, it's a long journey. A ship has to sail around the Arabian Peninsula, enter the Red Sea, and then pass through the Suez Canal, a major bottleneck where vessels wait in line and pay serious money for transit. One accident there and the entire trade chain starts to fall apart. And the route doesn't end there. After Suez, the ship still has to cross the entire Mediterranean, enter the Atlantic, sail around Europe, and only then reach the Baltic. Altogether, that takes about 40 days. It's slow, expensive, and not very flexible. And that's where the Iran-Rud Canal comes in. With it, the route would become way more direct. Ships could head almost straight north without those enormous detours. Transit time could shrink to roughly 2 weeks. That's a completely different level. Faster delivery, lower costs, and more trips per year. Now look at countries like Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. Right now, access to the open ocean is a real challenge for them. Cargo's first loaded onto ships in the Caspian Sea, then transferred to trains in another country, and then transferred again. Every transfer costs money, wastes time, and adds risk. As a result, their goods become more expensive and less competitive. But with Iran-Rud, everything changes. Formally, the borders stay the same, but in practice, those countries would gain direct access to the world's oceans. The Caspian would stop being a closed inland body of water and turn into a massive transportation hub. From there, cargo could be sent to India, China, or Africa without endless transshipment. That would mean Kazakhstan, for example, could sell grain or oil almost as freely as countries with direct ocean access, like Brazil or Australia. But surely you don't think Iran simply wants to make trade easier for everyone else? Of course not. When it comes to trade, Tehran would clearly have interests of its own. You all probably know what's happening around the Strait of Hormuz right now. Iran is making it clear that it now holds real leverage there, and that ships effectively have to deal with Tehran to pass through. On top of that, there's the possibility that Tehran could begin charging transit fees for every passage. Now imagine if, before the current conflict, another major route had already been built. Iran could have collected transit money from cargo flows, and a lot of money, because an enormous volume of goods would move through such a canal. Many Caspian countries would have little choice but to use it since it would become their only truly practical route to the world's oceans. And Iran's gains wouldn't stop at transit fees. It could also develop the canal corridor itself. A route like this would trigger the rise of new industrial clusters in Iran's desert regions, where goods would not simply pass through but also be processed. Because the canal would sit at the crossroads of massive flows of raw materials and technology. Its banks would likely fill up with factories and logistics hubs. And one more important point, a Caspian-Persian Gulf canal could also help Iran pull itself out of a very deep crisis. In eastern Iran, water's a treasure. That's especially true in Sistan and Baluchistan, where the situation is already being described as water bankruptcy. Underground aquifers are nearly depleted, and in some places the land is starting to sink, as if the support beneath it's been pulled away. But the clearest example is Lake Hamoun. It was once enormous by regional standards, up to about 2,200 square miles of water in the middle of the desert. The lake was fed by the Helmand River, and a whole ecosystem depended on it. Fish, birds, and agriculture all thrived around it. Then everything began to collapse. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, the lake started losing water at a dramatic pace. Within just a few years, it lost nearly 89% of its surface area. By 2001, it had effectively disappeared. And that's where the real problem began. When the water recedes, it doesn't leave behind a lake bed. What remains is a vast, exposed surface of salt and silt. The wind lifts that mixture into the air, turning the region into a constant source of dust storms. During certain periods, their intensity can increase by around 40%. At that point, this is no longer just an environmental issue, it affects people directly. Fishing disappears, wildlife dies off, and farmland turns to dust. Former shoreline areas start getting buried in sand, sometimes literally swallowing homes. Settlements are abandoned. People leave because living there becomes physically unbearable. So the question is, how could salty water from the Persian Gulf possibly help? You can't drink it, you can't use it directly to irrigate crops, and you certainly can't just pour it into a drying lake. The answer lies in technology. The idea is to build large-scale desalination plants and then direct the treated water to cities and farmland. At the same time, some of that water could be used to at least partially sustain Lake Hamoun so it doesn't keep turning into a giant source of dust. But even without desalination, there's another interesting effect. If a major canal were built through the region, the sheer mass of water itself could begin to change the surrounding environment. Under the sun, the water would evaporate, gradually adding moisture to the dry desert air. In effect, it would act like a massive natural humidifier. That could lead to several benefits at once. The air would become less harsh, dust storms could be suppressed somewhere closer to the ground, and the heat would feel less extreme. Breathing there could become easier. The canal could also function as a barrier. It would make it harder for sand to move freely, while some of the moisture would gradually seep into nearby soil. Under those conditions, it would become possible to plant protective forest belts, vegetation that stabilizes the ground and helps stop the desert from spreading farther. Overall, the cost would be enormous. But the project really does look like it could become a game changer for Iran. Who knows? After everything the country's going through now, maybe it will eventually move toward making it happen. The potential benefits could be massive. But if we go back to the Caspian Sea, another question comes up. Why have the countries bordering it never really tried to fix the problem? In fact, they did try. Back in the days when most of the countries were part of a single state. Yes, I'm talking about the Soviet era. Even back then, the Caspian Sea was already losing water at an alarming rate. Soviet experts spent years studying the problem and eventually came to a clear conclusion. The main culprit was Kara-Bogaz-Golbey. Scientists have realized that it functions like a giant natural frying pan. They realized the bay acted like a giant natural evaporation pan. It was extremely shallow and sat in a hot desert climate. Water from the Caspian flowed into it through a massive strait and then quickly evaporated, never returning to the sea. Every year, this natural evaporator was removing up to 3.6 cubic miles of water, and at a time when the Caspian's level was already failing, that seemed like an unacceptable loss. So the Soviet authorities decided that if the bay was the problem, they needed to cut it off completely. In 1980, the Soviet government made a drastic decision. It sealed off the narrow strait with a solid dam. The idea was simple enough: block the flow, keep the water in the sea, and solve the Caspian shrinking water problem with one bold engineering project. But if that was the plan, why is there no dam on the map today? And why is the bay full of water again? What happened there? The whole thing went badly wrong. Once the bay was cut off from the Caspian, it dried up almost completely within just a few years and turned into a lifeless salt desert. Winds began lifting salt from the exposed seabed and carrying it for hundreds of miles, damaging pastures and poisoning the soil across the surrounding region. In the end, it became obvious that this attempt to outsmart nature had turned into an ecological disaster. The dam had to be undone. At first, pipes were installed to let at least some water through, but that was nowhere near enough. So in 1992, the dam was finally blown up, restoring the natural flow. So if we want to save the Caspian Sea, we need to study everything very carefully. The ecosystem is just too fragile for rushed decisions.